I'm Daryl Kimball with the Arms Control Association. We're very pleased to be working with Sarah Hagusti and her excellent team at Win Without War on this event from Trinity to today. We're going to be moving from the past into the present day a bit. First, I just want to acknowledge the fantastic comments, observations, insights from our previous panel. I've worked in this field a long time, but every time I hear such powerful statements, experiences, it really is moving. And I just want to express appreciation for everybody who has shared their experiences, their stories, and their insights. Because that work has reshaped nuclear history for the better. And it reminds us that civil society organizations, not just here in the United States, but around the world, have been successful in pushing governments to take more responsible actions to reduce the nuclear danger, to cut the number of nuclear weapons, to halt and ban nuclear weapons testing, and to curb the spread of nuclear weapons. But we are still here today, 80 years after the first nuclear test explosion, after the first nuclear use of nuclear weapons, and the nuclear sword of Damocles that President Kennedy spoke about in the early 1960s still hangs over every person on the planet. So this next panel that we will move into in just a moment is going to talk about today's nuclear dangers, the catastrophic consequences of nuclear war, and what we can do about it. And to get us in the mood, if you will, to remind us of what is at stake, we want to present a short illustrative video of what might happen if, in a crisis that might happen today, a crisis, a war involving US, NATO forces and Russian forces, if one side or the other were to use nuclear weapons. Such a scenario, unfortunately, is not fiction, it's not theoretical, it's very real. Remember, in the fall of 2022, the US government believed that there was a 50% chance that Vladimir Putin might order the use of nuclear weapons, so-called tactical nuclear weapons, in Ukraine. Luckily, President Putin did not. But the scenario that you're about to see, which is a video presentation called Plan A, explains what it might have looked like if that scenario played out in a different way. So this Plan A video was researched and produced by the expert team at Princeton University's Program on Science and Global Security. It was published in 2018, and it provides a sense of the scope and scale of the devastation that could occur in just the first few minutes and hours. So I think we're ready to show this. And you'll see this is why Presidents Reagan and Gorbachev warned that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought.
I'll say I've never been more terrified by watching a map. Obviously, that video shows how high the stakes are. And all of our speakers today have shown us that when you see those numbers and then think about the potential human toll there, it is truly horrifying, which is why our next panel is so important, where we are talking about what is at stake today and what we can do about it. And I am very delighted to introduce our moderator for this panel, the wonderful Emma Blecher, who is the president of Plowshares Fund, a dear friend, and whose work has been so critical in this field, not only in terms of the way we think about impact, but the way we think of the how of the work as well. And thank you so much.
And other panelists, please come up.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sarah. Welcoming up the other panelists as well now. I want to thank you and Daryl and everyone at Arms Control Association and Win Without War for hosting this very timely event. I'm honoured to be moderating the panel today. And as Sarah said, I'm president of Plowshares, and at Plowshares, we've been proud to support this field of people working really hard. Not all of them over the last 40 years, but for the last 40 years, some of them probably. But what we're trying to do here is really bring different people who have an interest and a stake, and we all do, in this issue, and figure out how we work together, how we collaborate, how we bring together different constituents to have a really big impact on preventing what we just saw on the wall. That's particularly why I'm delighted to see this collaboration between Win Without War and Arms Control Association. Two organisations that have different areas of expertise that combined can join together to have greater impact. It's something we're really trying to work on and support at Plowshares, so we're delighted to see this example. And so I think let's think about this event today as a real opportunity to remember why we're here, remember what we are commemorating, and remind ourselves of the opportunity, as hard as they are, of these tragic anniversaries, to look back at where we've been, to look at where we are now, and to look forward to the future. And I think that's hopefully what this last panel is about. It's about where are we today? It's about getting a sense of informing ourselves about where we are, how we can mobilise, what we need to do to be successful, and how we can advance sound policies that bring us closer to the more safe and secure world that we desire, that we need, that we deserve. So I hope from this panel you'll find inspiration about actions that you can take, because I think as we've learnt today here, nuclear threats affect all of us, and it's going to take all of our work to be able to stop them. So I'm delighted to introduce our panelists here. First, we have Thomas Countryman. He is the board chair of the Arms Control Association, and he's also the former US Assistant Secretary of State for Non-Proliferation and International Security. Then we have Molly McGinty, who's the Program Director for International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. And last but not least, David Courtwright, visiting scholar at Cornell University, and he's also a member of the Win Without War Board of Directors. What we're going to do now is start with some framing remarks from each of the panellists. Then I'm going to ask them each a question or two, and we'll turn to the audience for more questions. So I want to call on Tom first to lay out what's the current risk landscape, particularly if we don't see diplomatic progress in the near future. Tom, I believe there's a microphone you can use there, or you're welcome to come up to the podium if you'd like.
Thank you, Emma. Statistically speaking, the probability of a nuclear war happening in the next day or two is very low. That's the only good news I have. The bad news is the risk of a nuclear war, the probability is not zero. It has never been zero in the last 75 years. And the worst news is that the risk of nuclear war is higher today than at any point since the Cuban crisis of 1962. We have avoided nuclear conflict for 75 years. Some, including those who have had their fingers on the nuclear button, will admit, through sheer luck. Others will claim it is the success of a nuclear deterrence strategy. But it is not a scientifically valid procedure to rely on luck or to rely on a deterrence policy that by definition will always work until it doesn't. There are a number of reasons why the immediate risk today is higher than before. Now, what the US and the Soviet Union worried about and built forces against was the risk of the so-called bolt from the blue, that the opposing party would wake up one morning and launch all their forces against another. Nearly everyone agrees that although this is still physically possible, it is extremely unlikely. Rather, the likelihood of nuclear war stems, as you saw in this little video, in an escalation, intentional, accidental, or other, from a conventional conflict into an all-out nuclear war. And all the war games played in secrecy or publicly over the years have shown that once tactical or non-strategic nuclear weapons are used, it always escalates to an all-out strategic conflict. The risk is high today because we have more flashpoints at which a conventional conflict between nuclear-armed adversaries and neighbors could occur. It could be India, Pakistan, and we've seen in recent years the first example ever of two nuclear-armed states flying combat missions over each other's territory. It certainly could be between Ukraine and Russia, as the Russian leader has used unprecedented threats of nuclear use in order to form a shield against any countering action by the Ukrainians defending their country. It's higher today also because, frankly speaking, we do not have the same caliber of statesman that we used to. Normally, with a PowerPoint, I put up the pictures of the 9 men, and of course they are all men, who have their fingers on the nuclear button today, and ask the audience, how many of these 9 men do you trust to do the right thing in a crisis? And I've never gotten an answer higher than 5. The median is between 2 and 3. At the same time, there are more plans made for the use of non-strategic, so-called tactical or battlefield nuclear weapons. Now, it is the job of military planners to think about every possible contingency and to write a plan for every contingency, and I don't begrudge them that job. But the fact is, the more plans you have on the shelf that involve the use of tactical nuclear weapons in response to either a conventional or a nuclear scenario, the more likely those plans are going to be used because they are immediately available. The situation is, well, let's quote the old Russian saying, the situation is never so bad that it can't get a lot worse. And the fact is, it can get worse. Those are the risks we face today. The situation that we face today, the reality we face today, is that we are already in a 3-way nuclear arms race that exceeds in risk and expense anything that we witnessed in the 50s and 60s. Now, the United States, China, and Russia will all deny that they are arm racing. We are only doing practical, common sense responses to a threat posed by those guys arms racing. Russia can point to US plans for a ballistic missile shield as it builds new, crazy, stupid types of weapon delivery systems. The United States can point to China growing its nuclear warhead as a justification not just for modernizing delivery systems, but for building additional warheads. China can say, as it more than doubles its arsenal, we are just doing some housekeeping, making sure that our second strike capability is up to snuff. All of this reciprocal or circular action is what drives an expense that is mind-blowing when you explain it to most Americans. Spending already $100 billion a year on sustaining and upgrading our nuclear weapons and the delivery systems for them, an amount that becomes even more absurd if you throw in one of the greatest boondoggles in defense industry history, the president's plan for a Golden Dome ballistic missile defense. And this is happening in the complete absence of a diplomatic dialogue between the United States and Russia, and the absence of even a conversation between the United States and China. The New START Treaty, the last legal limit on what the US and Russia can deploy, will expire less than a year from now, in February 2026. And while there are a dozen simple and not so simple ways that we could address that without expanding the deployment of our nuclear weapons, there is no effort being made by the United States or by Russia to advance such an agreement. In the expiration of that agreement, both sides will be capable of fairly rapidly uploading additional weapons onto existing launchers, reversing the one real accomplishment of Cold War negotiations, that is, the reduction by 85% of the deployment of nuclear warheads by Washington and Moscow. At the same time, we have no dialogue, not even conversation, with the Chinese. There's one encouraging word we've heard, and we should welcome it and encourage it when President Trump says he believes we spend too much, that we could have smaller arsenals, a smaller nuclear budget. He's not acted on this so far. And in terms of preparing for a negotiation, there ain't nobody home. Not at the National Security Council, where there are no nuclear experts at the moment, and not at the State Department, particularly after 1,000 of my former colleagues are laid off tomorrow. What can be done about it? Well, we're talking about the US here, but I want us to keep in mind that I'm frankly disappointed in the rest of the world, who sends out diplomats at the level that I was at to say, we've got to do more. But they don't send out their president or their prime minister to talk to any of the nuclear powers and say, we demand more. As allies and as potential victims of your arsenals, we expect you to do more. What can we do in the US? You'll hear a lot more, so very brief thoughts. In the US, still, as of today, public opinion still matters. The power of the people is still mightier than the people in power, if we speak. And the public here can demand things that the public in some of the other nuclear weapon states cannot do. And Molly and David will speak more about that. But keep in mind that despite the intention of the experts to prevent or discourage public discussion, when you talk to the people, public opinion polls clearly show that most Americans want arms control, want to spend less on nuclear weapons, want a reduction of risk. And you heard that in times past, the people have moved the power structure in that direction. So as we go forward, keep in mind, we have the majority. We have the history on our side. And when we say reverse the arms race, we have the message. Now we have to build the momentum and build the movement. Thanks.
Is this working? No. Okay. Have I turned it on? No. Okay. Never mind. Can people hear me without? Okay. Fantastic. Well, what I really wanted to say was thank you so much, Tom, for that very clear articulation of the dangers we're in now, throwing in a little bit of humour along the way, which helps, but a clear call to action about what is possible because we've seen it before. So to talk further about what's possible and what people can do, I'd love to welcome Molly to make a few remarks too.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I am going to read from my phone because I am a product of my generation, so apologies if it doesn't look great on the video. I'm so glad to be here with you all today. What an incredible, moving, inspiring, and terrifying afternoon to spend with each of you. I want to thank all the panelists earlier today, especially those from affected communities and affected regions, for sharing their testimonies and for really speaking truth to power and encouraging us to take action, which is a bit of what I will speak about just now, of the work that we have ahead, the things that each of us in this room can do, and the things that we can ask folks in our hometowns and our communities to do going forward. You know, I think it's especially important that we're meeting here today on the just before the 80th anniversary of the Trinity test, which often gets overlooked and unacknowledged, even though it's the first example of nuclear harm in the history. So we're going to look at moving beyond the legacy, but using that power of the legacy to promote progress and future of this work. And look at what regular people can do. As our panelists said earlier, we're moving nuclear weapons out of the abstract. We're not talking about theories of deterrence. We're not talking about specific warhead numbers. We're not talking about specific delivery systems. We're talking about what these weapons do, their human and environmental cost, which is incredibly important to move not only people, but to move policy. And that must include both, again, the living legacy of the Hibakusha, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki survivors, communities affected by over 2,000 nuclear tests worldwide, atomic veterans, and those harmed by uranium mining. But we must also look at the devastating consequences of nuclear war and the threat that we face today. It was outlined in this video, and terrifyingly enough, as I sat there with goosebumps up my arm after watching that video does not show the whole story. Tens of millions of people dead by the end of a day does not, that doesn't close out the picture here. It doesn't show the long-term global devastation of a full-scale nuclear war, which is estimated that 5 billion people worldwide will die in the 2 years following a nuclear exchange between the US and Russia. That's due to soot and debris lofted into the atmosphere, which blocks the sun and disrupts global food and agriculture production. That obviously has global implications, including for the non-nuclear armed world, those states that have taken a stance against nuclear weapons and have said that they're incompatible with human life, as we all know. So today, the risk of nuclear use is not theoretical. It's not just theoretical, it's also growing. I won't speak too much on this because, again, Tom just scared us as well in addition to the video. But we see rising tensions between nuclear arms states, erosion of arms control treaties, emerging technologies like AI being integrated into nuclear arms command and control systems, rising distrust in science and authority figures, and a global system under stress from climate change and authoritarianism. People know this, though. In 2023, a study by the Chicago Council and Carnegie Corporation found that while lacking familiarity about U.S. nuclear weapons policy, a majority, 60% of U.S. public also said they're interested in learning more. So people are aware of the danger, they want to learn more, which to me then begs action, as we've spoken about today. A 2020 study by the ICRC found that millennials believe it's more likely than not that a nuclear attack will occur in the next decade. Again, the study was in 2020 before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, before recent conflict between India and Pakistan, and before escalating concerns and consequential bombings of Iran's nuclear facilities. The same Chicago Council and Carnegie survey found that 21% said that they would like to be more involved in influencing US policy. So the question is, where is that 21%? Why aren't they in the room? Why don't we have mass mobilization in this country? And I believe that it's not because of apathy. I think it's anxiety and a feeling of lack of agency. We're clearly not getting to these people about the common sense solutions that we have forward. So we know that action, which is bringing these existential issues down to the local level and connecting local action with national legislation and vice versa, is already happening across the country and around the world. So I'm going to give a few examples of actions that are already going on, which show ways that people can get involved, again, both in DC and elsewhere. I think it's especially important for these conversations to happen outside of the Beltway here. As we heard about in this morning's presentation, the recent expansion of RECA, the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, which provides necessary financial compensation to communities harmed by nuclear weapons testing in the Southwest, would not have been possible without grassroots organizing. That's work done by the Tularosa Basin Downwinders Consortium, indigenous leaders, networks within the Union of Concerned Scientists, and others. This expansion is the largest in history, as Mary told us earlier, and will help tens of thousands of people, but the work is not done. So if you are not yet involved in RECA expansion, if you have not yet contacted your member of Congress, if you have not yet talked to members of your community about expanding RECA, please do so. Talk to your representatives. This is actually a bipartisan issue, or with bipartisan support. All of this is a bipartisan issue. It has bipartisan support, so don't hesitate to reach out to any of your elected officials. There's work on city and local levels to influence local and national policies. So Back from the Brink is a US-based grassroots coalition of individuals, organizations, and elected officials working toward a world free of nuclear weapons and advocating for common sense nuclear weapons policies. So that includes a 5-point policy platform. I think I'll spend my precious time here not going through all five points, but please look them up on preventnuclearwar.org. Over 78 municipalities and towns, including DC, 8 state legislative bodies, and 44 members of Congress have endorsed the Back from the Brink platform. And for the past few years, we've seen the Back from the Brink platform introduced as resolutions in the House and the Senate. Again, this would not be possible without that work on the grassroots, without normal people like you and me. I hope you still consider yourselves to be normal, but you and me taking action and encouraging this local action. There's Mayors for Peace, which obviously connects this issue with mayors worldwide. Globally, ICANN leads a number of issues bringing this bringing the threat of nuclear war down to the local level, including Cities Appeals, which is a similar platform to Back from the Brink, and parliamentary pledges. It builds this groundswell of support and public opinion, which alerts decision makers to this threat. The Alliance for Nuclear Accountability is another platform. I think Win Without War, doesn't need a shout out here, but it's a coalition-based structure with an emphasis on grassroots action, not just education. And I think it provides a really important model for all of us on the power of intersectional solidarity in practice. There are also a number of coalitions that relate to or connect people with where they already are, including health groups like Physicians for Social Responsibility, youth and student groups like Students for Nuclear Disarmament and Youth for TPNW, science groups like the Physicians Coalition, and many, many others. So wherever people are, I guarantee that there is a peace or nuclear disarmament organization that they can and should plug into to take local action. This can include divestment campaigns, education, film screens, protests, phone banking, letter writing campaigns, and more. And it's something that needs to be inclusive. This is something that's spoken about very, very often in disarmament spaces of how we reach more people. You know, the people are so aware of the climate crisis. Why aren't there more climate people involved? And I would encourage everybody here to go to climate events, to talk to people to talk to climate leaders, to take action on that existential threat as well. We can't expect people to show up for us if we don't show up for them. I'm certainly missing many, many actions and groups and coalitions that exist, but I have two kind of tools as to why I think the ones that I listed are effective and why I think more people should get involved. And that includes centering the human and environmental cost of these weapons and giving people concrete actions. Again, taking these weapons out of the abstract and telling people what they can do about it. We can't scare people to be paralyzed. We need to talk to people about the threat that we all face and give them concrete actions to take. I have a whole list of how we've seen grassroots activism work in the past, but I have 1 minute left. And there's a lot of history to cover there, and we've heard much of it today. But I would just say the partial test ban treaty, the CTBT, and the end of the arms race would all not have been possible without grassroots activism. And most recently, the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which has support from the majority of the world's nations, would not have gone into effect in 2021 without grassroots support, without centering the human cost of these weapons, and without people in countries taking actions. This work would not just happen by diplomats getting together. We know that they're not the most creative, and it's something that all of us need to engage in. Sorry. So with that, my time is up. But as the day has gone on, Susan mentioned humor in her presentation. Obviously, I sometimes have a little bite to what I say, but I like to follow ICANN Australia's founding motto, which is horror, humor, and hope, which is what we all need to center in the work ahead. So thank you.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Molly. And while you were speaking, I was actually being of your generation and trying to text Sarah Hagdousti, but she wasn't of your generation. She wasn't on her phone. What I'm presuming is that you'll be able to share a list of resources that Molly just mentioned with attendees and people tuning in, because there are excellent organisations and efforts and ways for you to plug in. So terrific. So thank you so much, Molly. And, one more generational comment here. It is terrific that we have people of your generation who are really interested in this issue, because it was definitely something that seized earlier generations. And it's terrific to see the baton being passed. And I'd like to call on David now to talk about earlier generations and the freeze movement of the 1980s, because I think there's surely a lot of inspiration we can take from that. So thank you very much, David.
Good afternoon. Is this still? No, it's not on. It's on. Okay, great. So I thought I'd be clever in using my phone. I'm certainly not of the techie generation, and I don't know where my remarks are. So it doesn't really matter, I guess. But let me give it one more chance. When you speak last in this program with so many incredibly articulate presenters, it's really hard to come up with something new that hasn't already been said. And since I don't have my remarks, maybe that's good, so I won't go on and on. But a couple of points I do want to emphasize, and I'll try to draw from, the new generation is here to save me. Yeah. Thank you, sorry. I want to talk about some observations on the strategy for opposing nuclear weapons today, drawing from that history. So one clear point is that the political power that's necessary to end the arms race is not going to come from the establishment in Washington. It will have to flow from the bottom up, from the grassroots primarily. And in the history of the atomic age, progress towards arms limitation has often come from political power at the community level or from organized constituencies. The campaign of the scientists in the late 40s to impose civilian control on atomic energy. The movements of the 1960s and early 70s to halt atmospheric nuclear testing. And then, of course, the disarmament and nuclear freeze movements of the 80s. All of these movements achieved progress in reducing the nuclear danger, at least partially. As activists, we often feel powerless. We have difficulty recognizing success. Even when our actions are having an impact, we may not recognize it. One of the great writers, Rebecca Solnit, said that it's always too early to calculate effect. Things will unfold in the future in ways that we can't predict. I remember after the June 12, 1982 rally in Central Park and talked to a colleague, and she was despondent that 1 million people in Central Park, and yet the arms race was continuing. It hadn't brought about political change. But we have to be patient, and we have to recognize that the ways in which movements have impact are not always recognizable. But certainly the freeze movement had enormous success. It's already been talked about, the freeze rally itself. We don't often think about the 1982 ballot initiatives in which the freeze was on the ballot in 9 states and dozens of major cities, including Washington. 18 million Americans voted on the freeze that year, and 60% voted in favor. And I think most importantly was the grassroots presence of the freeze campaign. It was everywhere. Politicians couldn't avoid it, and it provided a persistent pressure for change to reduce the nuclear danger. The White House attacked the freeze proposition and did so continuously, but the movement was too popular to ignore. And Reagan was forced to respond. And we now have historical evidence from the archives of this administration, and I did some interviews with many of the principals myself back in the 90s, that the administration responded to the freeze movement by toning down its bellicose rhetoric and promising to negotiate for peace. Nuclear saber rattling gave way to messages of moderation and support for arms control. And it's important to remember that all of this occurred before Gorbachev arrived on the political scene. The change was the result of organized political protest. Reagan won re-election in 1984 in part by co-opting the freeze message and portraying himself as a peace candidate. Freeze campaign coordinator at the time, Randy Keeler, observed that the Ronald Reagan elected in 1984 was quite different than the Ronald Reagan of 1980. The freeze movement created a political climate conducive to arms reduction, and the president adjusted his sails accordingly. The movement had many other impacts, of course. I was very involved in the Stop MX campaign, which forced the cancellation of the mobile basing system in Utah and Nevada and whittled down this very menacing missile system from 200 to 50 missiles. And Susan Gordon and others have talked about the multi-year campaign to stop nuclear testing, and in 1992 was finally successful in cutting off any funding for nuclear tests. There were many other multiple ways in which the movement had impact. So history shows that movements are able to shape policy if they employ wise strategies, if they attract broad public support, and articulate compelling narratives, and most importantly, if they're persistent. Here I want to offer a few key principles of effective activism that I've gleaned from decades of experience and research. Movements succeed when they attract mass participation, especially from the grassroots. Movements need visionary goals, like a world without nuclear weapons, but also practical, achievable policy objectives, such as halting the development of new nuclear weapons. The power of movements depends on building broad and diverse coalitions. Media communications and effective framing of messages are essential. and it is necessary to engage in institutional politics, especially now, I believe, with the 2026 midterm elections debate looming, that we must prepare a massive mobilization on behalf of candidates who oppose Trumpism and will support a halt to nuclear weapons building. And lastly, allies are critically important. And for the peace and disarmament movement, the religious community is a primary partner. And I think it's time for us to reach out again to our sisters and brothers in the faith communities. One of the challenges of nuclear activism today is the presence of so many other agenda issues and the very powerful and important movement that's developed against Trump. The protests, the hands-off, and No Kings mobilizations have been historic and inspiring, and I'm sure many of us have been part of them. But the resistance movement is focused primarily on domestic issues. Military spending and nuclear issues are raised at some events, but they need much more emphasis. I believe that to build a broader movement for nuclear disarmament today, we need a coalitional approach, one that links opposition to war and the nuclear arms race to the anti-Trump mobilizations for social justice and the defense of democracy. This approach requires dialogue and mutual support among a range of movements. The purpose is to build networks of mutual trust in which separate groups can weigh in together on key points. And here I shout out to Bill Hartung for his recent article making this very point. Yeah. Achieving a domestic progressive agenda requires reductions in excessive arms spending and a shift in budget priorities to emphasize social and environmental investment rather than war preparation. This awareness creates the basis for building activist unity on social justice and disarmament. The key to effective collaboration among movements is clear messaging and common demands that can attract support across social sectors. A good example is the recent slogan that Win Without War and Move On and others were offering during the budget debates and the attacks on Iran. Healthcare, not warfare. Opportunities for cooperation are likely to increase as huge increases in nuclear weapons spending come at the expense of critically needed social programs. A case in point is the recently announced 53% increase in the budget for nuclear warhead complex activities, while the new budget bill slashes funding for Medicaid. The shameful Republican budget cuts funding for medical insurance, SNAP, and other vital social programs by approximately $1 trillion over the coming decade. That amount, $1 trillion, is also what the US government will spend on rebuilding nuclear weapon systems in the coming decade. These comparisons starkly reveal our nation's warped priorities. We must speak out against this madness. We cannot remain silent. No matter how difficult the odds, we must register our loud disapproval. Many of us are unifying around the message, more nuclear weapons do not make us safe. We have joined together to issue the global appeal for the US and other countries to halt and reverse the arms race. We're calling on them to end the building of new nuclear bombs and missile systems. And this has to occur on all sides, US and Russia and China together. Is it likely to happen in the near future? Probably not. But if we learn from our successes in the past and are persistent and strategic in building effective alliances and communicating compelling narratives, we can begin to turn the tide. That's our challenge. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, David, for sharing your wisdom and also reminding us of the importance of patience, because it can be challenging to keep going and going, but it's really critically important because that's what's going to get us there in the long run. So thank you for that. Now, just going to ask the organisers, we've got 20 minutes for Q&A. Why don't I start off with some questions while people are writing something down on their index cards, hand them up here, and we'll kind of take things as they go. I'm going to start with you, Tom. You mentioned President Trump's declared interest in potentially reducing nuclear weapons, and he made some. There were some overtures between him and Vladimir Putin early on, maybe even before he'd taken office, about their desire to talk potentially, and then for various reasons that sort of disappeared. But we know that President Trump is petrified of nuclear weapons, doesn't like them. I mean, I don't meet many people who aren't petrified of nuclear weapons, to be frank, but we do know that he is particularly concerned. What kind of messages from civil society do you think could be effective to try to send to President Trump in this moment to compel him to take action?
Great question. I think he does mean it as much as he means anything he says, that he would like to see less money spent in fewer nuclear weapons and the nuclear risk reduced. And it would be valuable for civil society to find a way to encourage him in this. And the simple message can be, Mr. President, we agree with you. We hope that your next budget reflects what you said was a priority, which is to spend less on nuclear weapons. It's hard to be optimistic because, I mean, you mentioned that perhaps President Putin reciprocated this sentiment. Not that I can see. I don't see any evidence that he has. I do see that the Russian power structure is ready for discussions about nuclear issues with the United States, but the U.S. structure, diplomatic and military and National Security Council, is not ready. More ominously, everything that the president says is echoed by an amen chorus from within his own party. Everything he says except this. I have not seen members of his party trip over themselves on the way to the microphone to say, yes, we agree that we should spend less on nuclear weapons. It goes against the prevailing sentiment in his own party. And in some cases, Mr. Trump is successful in that, and in other cases not. But I wish I could see at least one member of his own party stand up and say, you're right, Mr. President, let's work on that.
Thanks very much. Really important insight there. So I'd like to turn to Molly now. So you talked about the challenge of people feeling that this is abstract, overwhelming, they don't have a sense of agency. And there are lots of issues that are kind of taking people's attention away from this one. How do you think you can give people agency in this moment? Like, what's the breakthrough here, or how do you relate to people at this time when there's so much going on?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one that I think requires probably a roundtable conversation with every single person in this room and online to talk about. I think one piece that's really important is that people are scared right now. Again, it is on people's mind. The nuclear threat is on people's mind, and I will repeat what I said earlier, and just that I think that we're not reaching people and sharing what they can do. I think generally right now people feel apathy and they feel like they have no control over this administration and over this Congress. And the more and more that we can encourage collaboration and encourage community building and encourage connection, that's how people feel that hope, and that's how people will feel encouraged to stay involved. Might be quite cliche, but that is what comes to mind immediately. And secondly, a reminder to those people and maybe to folks in this room is that nuclear weapons intersect with every single issue that people are working on, whether we're talking about climate, whether we're talking about militarism more broadly, democracy. Nuclear weapons are an undemocratic force in our world right now, whether we're talking about crisis response or anything else. Nuclear weapons connect to all of these issues. So wherever people are working, we should be able to reach them and encourage them to add this issue to their platform, encourage them to come to our meetings. And again, we can support them at theirs. So I think, yeah, the anecdotes to apathy are connection, and encouraging action where people already are.
Thank you, Molly. That was really important, and I agree with what you said. And especially, I think what's interesting is that the concern about nuclear weapons is growing. There's an awareness. I keep running into it where unusual places where people are writing articles about the new and growing nuclear threat, the arms race. And how do you mobilize people? Well, thinking again back to our history, what catalyzed a lot of the freeze movement was we came up with a new idea, freeze, US and Soviet Union together. And among people who, the fear factor was much greater then in terms of what the polling data showed. But people who were eager to find some escape from this awful threat latched onto that, and they really began to organize. So that's part of the logic for why some of us are talking about this freeze and reverse concept. Maybe it can catch on, I don't know, but we ought to try it. And it's global, so it's US, Russia, China, and that we can try to offer a simple proposition that's easy to understand and that probably most people would agree with readily and move out with that. So I think that's a key factor. And then the last thing you said too about how this issue links with everything else. And we have, as I mentioned in my remarks, this massive resistance that's underway, probably maybe the biggest mass mobilization in US history. 5 million people or more were turning out for the No Kings rally. And all of the issues that are being talked about there are also related to this excessive military spending and nuclear development. So conversations with the organizers of those movements is really important. I mean, Sarah is part of those tables to some extent, more than most of us, but figuring out how we can be at those rallies. I want to go to them as often as they get called and raise my voice against this Trump madness, but also then I want to hear some speeches that about these budget matters. You know, this $1 trillion being taken from our needed social programs and Medicare that's going to build new nuclear weapons instead. We need to get that idea out there much more. So.
Thanks, David. Actually, you started touching on something that relates to the next audience question, which is really about the sort of the transnational nature of this. It's clearly a global issue. We know that the question here is, how can today's nuclear disarmament activists learn from historical transnational movements? You've done a lot of work on movements, and I'm wondering if you could add in that transnational aspect, because back during freeze days, there were also demonstrations in the UK. We know that influenced President Reagan as well. So I'm wondering if you've got something you could add on the transnational aspect.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, during the freeze movement, the transnational character of the movement was actually fairly limited. There were enormous disarmament movements all across Europe, and there was also the freedom movement and democracy movement in the East. And there were some groups, such as European Nuclear Disarmament, Mary Calder and others, that crossed the divide and talked with folks in Poland and Czechoslovakia, and also with the folks in Western Europe. And there were some discussions going on in the Soviet Union. This became more possible when Gorbachev came to power with some of their key experts, people like Alexei Arbatov and others who were part of and his father were part of this whole power establishment. Today, it's much more difficult to conceptualize that. And we've talked a little bit about this at some prior meetings. I do think we can begin to reach out to retired officials, academic experts in China and Russia, offer this proposition that we're developing, see if they think it's viable, and start to have some conversations and get at least a few of significant experts from China and Russia who would say this is a good idea and something we can advocate on our side. That seems to be possible. Most of them would be exiles, our Russian friends who are in Kazakhstan and Poland and other countries. But that's significant to signify that it's a proposition that has some support among Russians and among Chinese, and that'll help to, I think, validate and legitimize the effort here at home, to be able to say that this is not just a unilateral thing, it is multilateral.
Thanks very much, David. This next question here is sort of, I think, noting an obvious tension here, right? Which is, how do we balance connecting the disarmament movement to the anti-Trump movement. So, David, you've talked about making those connections, but at the same time needing to try to actually find Republicans, as Tom pointed out, who aren't yet supporting President Trump in this effort. How do we still appeal to the Trump administration and Republicans and legislators who we might actually want to have support President Trump in these efforts? How do we square this circle of being critical on one hand and lying there, and trying to be supportive on the other hand? Who would like to try to answer that question? Tom.
It is possible to have two different priorities in your head at the same time and to speak in different registers about the two different priorities. We'll put it this way. I don't assume that every member of the president's party has permanently sacrificed their capability of independent thought. There clearly was, in the last couple of weeks, enormous pressure to toe the line on one particular issue. It is not clear that there will be the same pressure on every possible issue, on every possible vote. And there remains, as you can see in isolated cases, members of the president's party who are able to speak up independently with their own thoughts, their own priorities. It is possible for our movement, and I know that there are so many organizations that share this goal. Some of them are relatively more specialized in understanding the Congress and understanding the individuals who make up the Congress. And it is always worth having those quiet conversations at the same time that we are trying to have mass conversations with the public that already agrees with us but wants to do something more.
Thanks very much, Tom. So this question I'm going to have for Molly, it's going to be the last question. So an audience member is interested in the impact of 1983's The Day After. Molly, I'm coming to you because I'm just wondering if you can talk about the impact of art here and its ability to speak to people.
Yeah, that's great. That was in my notes that I skipped over because I reached 5 minutes and what I thought was 30 seconds. Yeah, I mean, the impact of The Day After, for those that don't know, it's said in, I believe, Reagan's diary that he watched The Day After, and the next day was when he reached out to Gorbachev, and from there we saw a quick reduction in global nuclear arsenal, which I think is also a reminder of how quickly things can change. But today, we don't have, 4 or 5 channels? I wasn't around at the time. 4 or 5 channels that everybody's watching. So there's no certainty that arts that is created today will reach Trump or will reach decision makers. That doesn't mean that it doesn't have power. We've seen with Oppenheimer 2 summers ago, that was in the cultural zeitgeist more than almost anything else and came back during the Oscars. And I believe a response from NTI and others in this field within Hollywood and really pushing people to talk and to act led to a comment at the Oscars of thanking the peace movement, which again is small but worth reminding people that we're still here and that there's still work that can and should be done. In addition to Oppenheimer, there's Annie Jacobson's Nuclear War, a scenario, which has received ample public attention and has been said will be created into a film in the coming years. So those are massive, kind of cultural touch points in recent years. There's also networks of artists against nuclear weapons. There's nuclear weapons artists against the bomb, which is a network of artists who are making art to show the impact of the weapons, to show the work ahead, and to show us the path forward. I think generally speaking, art can reach people in ways that we can't. You know, people will watch clips of this video, I'm sure, going forward, but who knows how many people will sit here and watch it all, where people can go to a museum, or people can see art on the street, or people can go to a film with their friends and have conversations beyond more academic or policy speak. So the impact of art is incredibly important. Again, there's networks that exist that are working on reaching more people through art. And yeah, leave it there.
Fantastic. Thank you, Molly. Before I thank all of the panelists, I would like to just read out this last question that we didn't get to. And we didn't get to it for a reason. It's because this could actually be a project that I think somebody could do, and at very least deserves a few hours of considered thought. Here's the question. Only 1 out of 170 executive orders of this administration mentions nuclear weapons, Iran's. Could you brainstorm on what an executive order might look like that could reduce nuclear risk? I think it's a great question. I'm just going to leave that with all of you. Let's get to work. But thank you, panelists, for your insights. It's a real privilege to work alongside you and alongside everyone in the audience and everyone online. You know, I think sometimes it can be hard doing this work and we feel kind of alone and, pardon the pun, a little bit siloed. We don't get the attention that we need and deserve. But I think as we grapple with all of these threats 80 years on from the Trinity test, I'm really energized by the dedication and the work of people in this room, and know that we're all working to put the human race before the arms race. And, you know, good luck to all of us. I hope good things are ahead. So please join me in thanking the panelists.